Hi, sorry to be the speaker before lunch. That's not only is it a shit slot for me, it's a shit slot for you. So if you can just kind of temper your blood sugar levels as they crash rapidly to the floor, that would be awesome. There's a few caveats that any speaker has to make. The first one is I'm a proud supporter of Furtherfield Gallery, and all of you should be. It is the museum of our time and everyone needs to invest in it. I also was the Deputy CEO of Tech City Investment Organisation, which means I used to work for the government. I apologise immensely for selling out. My parents and other artistic friends would hate me for it. By sort of training, I suppose I don't have any in almost any field. I'm neither an artist nor a developer, but I do paint and I do program. And what I want to talk about is some of the work that we've been doing in one of my companies called the Three Beards. And we decided stupidly, as you do over a beer when it's too late, that we would produce an art hack. We would create developers and artists, and we would put them together, and we would find a way for them to collaborate in a creative meaning. Now, I'm the son of a professor, which means I have a tendency to overanalyze, I have a tendency to overthink things. I tend to try and intellectualize every thought that I have in the attempt of sounding more intelligent than I really am. So I went through this process when trying to kind of think about how we would build the art hack. Now, luckily, we dealt quite effectively with Whitechapel Gallery. They provided us with the space that we could display our work in. So ultimately what we had there was straight away this point that I think the last speaker was trying to make, which is the outcome was very clearly defined. Straight away there is effectively the prize, right? The prize is you get to go and do something and become a real, inverted quote-unquote artist. You get to display in a real gallery, and you get to have an opening night with wine and canapes, and you get to feel massively and terribly important. This is a really great trick because everybody is operating on ego and pride, and so that's a really nice way to ensure that you're going to get through the sort of caliber and quality of people that you needed to go through. So all of these things aside, my talk is roughly entitled Encouraging Collaboration, Artists and Hackers. But the first kind of real point is to define both the notion of an artist and the notion of a hacker. Now, both of these things seem relatively simplistic at first, because an artist is obviously someone who is a manipulator of brushes or paper or space or form, and a hacker is someone who does all of these things but in a virtual two-dimensional flat screen environment. And we believe very strongly, and actually politicians certainly believe this and policymakers believe this, and I saw this a lot, that these two things are massively separate. That these two ideas are hugely, wildly disparate. The sort of educational facility that I've ever experienced believes that science and art are on the other end of the spectrum, and actually the qualities needed to do both are somehow impossible. That you can not be an artist or a scientist in the same way that people believe you can't be a scientist and you can be religious at the same time, or people believe that you cannot possibly be creative and logical simultaneously. Apparently these things are too baffling to our minds to even sort of comprehend the idea that one can take an abstract thought and nail it down into a rigid and linear process. I would argue that the reason that programming is massively important is it trains you to do exactly that. It trains you to think. You have to look at what you're trying to achieve, and then you have to go through step by step and work out exactly which pieces you're going to place in order to get to your outcome. Now, I would argue that an artist is entirely similar in that same place, that they have an idea that they're trying to sort of express and we're trying to challenge and to interrogate. However, we do not define ourselves by the process of which we're going to discover that. So we instead say, okay, this is an interesting idea. How am I going to get there? And you begin to explore multiple routes. Now, when you're programming, it's very hard really to sort of explore multiple routes unless you're sort of really problem solving. The reason it's hard to explore multiple routes is that it takes time, and it is a very, very slow and tedious process. So when you then have artists and hackers together in a space, often what you have to do is really ensure that there are specific and known limitations, which is why we run hackathons that are only 48 hours. The reason is if you give them 6 weeks or 8 weeks, then everything just sort of starts to amorphously grow and sort of eat its own self and create its own children and become this gigantic sprawling mess of creativity and ideas and hopes and dreams that never fully realizes itself, collapses massively on the end, and then no one wants to give you any more public money because you didn't produce any of the outcomes that you said you would achieve. The reason that keeping things really sort of small, and I think the point you're making about scale, about micro, absolutely essential. And the reason is because people are, unfortunately, across all disciplines, lazy. And unless you stand behind them with a whip, most people will think far too much before doing. Huh?
Steady.
I think it's generally true. Most people need focus, right? People need a reason, they need a pressure to get down. I think that's true. That's true. Most people are not achieving to the level they should be achieving. I'm not, and I think most people would agree that that is true. I'm sorry if that upsets all of you to realise this about the world, but it's very, very true. We could have peace in our own lifetime if we decided we wanted it, but we don't, and we are lazy people. And unfortunately, politicians are even lazier than the rest of us. So, moving on from this slightly sort of negative point about the state of humanity in 2014, we'll get back on track. Now, one of the most sort of interesting things that I was mistaken about was I genuinely believe by bringing artists of all fields, so we brought in sculptors and we brought in poets, we brought in musicians, we brought in visual artists. I believe that what my job as the facilitator of that position was going to be was to actually have to somehow explain and translate these ideas to the hacker and the geek over here. And so we spent a long time looking at how we would do that. You know, we were going to do games, drinking games, and sort of team building games, getting people to communicate, getting the Aspergic and difficult hacker, the slightly autistic, unable to communicate, only expressing themselves through ones and zeros. You know, we would bring them out of themselves. But we knew ultimately, as a programmer myself, that that's a fallacy, that's a myth. And we also kind of thought to ourselves, oh, the creative and the artist here is going to be so wild and crazy that they'll be floating around in a sort of a sea of their own imagination, and we'll have to nail them to the ground and get them to focus. Of course, in all reality, what actually happens is we put people together, we presented them with about 15 different data streams, a variety of APIs, a variety of data sets, and we said you have 48 hours to create art. And all we did was demonstrate what we believed to be interesting examples of collaboration, interesting examples of art and technology fusion. So earlier there was the mention of Nike and the Kinect and the 5 screens and one Kinect, and it's a bit rubbish. It is a little bit rubbish, it's certainly not challenging, it's not progressive in any fashion. However, it's still massively exciting to brands, and it's still quite interesting to those who don't know about it, unfortunately. Lots of children like it. So we used things like that as an example. Some great friends of mine, Helakar and Lewis, have done some fantastic work with Connect and working with autistic children who have particularly hard problems interacting physically with each other. And they've done this fantastic sort of piece, which is using Connect's. These children can share a same virtualized space. And the first thing that each of these children do is reach out and touch each other because it's a safe, defined space, and they know that it's not going to have the same emotional feelings. So we had a few of these sort of inspirational and heartwarming sort of examples of art and technology creating a much better environment for all. And then we literally opened the wine and the beer, and we put the music on, and we just let people talk. We were worried through the weekend, and we'd camped out at South Place Hotel. We'd rented a floor, so everyone had beds they can sleep in, and Wi-Fi, and freedom, and as much food as they could possibly eat, as much drink as they wanted to, coffee, Red Bull, the usual sort of technical hacking sort of stories. And everyone was there, and actually what was produced out of it was some really fascinating and interesting pieces that were both technically complicated and also artistically interesting. One of them was created by a chap called Steph Lewandowski, who took all of his wife's tweets and mapped and modelled those based on a series of parameters, including sentiment analysis, so passion, force, violence, mentions of the word love, frequency, gaps between the two, and he produced a 3D cut necklace, which is glorious, and on each of these little tiny long sort of droplet strands is one word that defines each of these. And he's now produced a small little side business that enables you to output all of your Twitter data. You can just plug in, and you can print your own necklace, and this necklace is now your Twitter, and you can wear it around your neck. I'm not entirely sure what the sort of long-term sociological impact of that is, but that's a separate conversation to be had later. Another one was a weather station that physically made a manifestation of the weather that you would search for. So, for example, if you were going to go to Sao Paulo, what you could do is you could enter in Sao Paulo on a connected device, and it had a heat lamp and a fan and a rain machine, and it would effectively play the remote weather. So you could kind of search for anything, and if it was windy, then the wind would blow. If it was warm, then it would be warm on your face. If it was raining, then rain would fall. We were slightly worried about this because not only, as my father used to tell me, electricity and water is a really bad idea, but we managed to make it work. But what was interesting there was Virgin Atlantic have now commissioned these people to produce this weather station as an interactive art piece to be displayed in executive lounges, so that you can say, what is the weather like where I am going? And so these boys, again, now have a little side business producing a very simple but non-complicated sort of version of this. We had our usual things. The last one we had was, this is now, is anyone here of a legal disposition? Is anyone particularly prone to suing or complaining or going to the police about any of the following things? Okay, good. So assuming this is a safe space where one can talk freely, we had an iPad installation which was called the Ministry of Communications for Citizen Safety, and which is, the acronym is COX, so apologies. Anyway, on this, and what it would do was using, most of you are probably unaware of quite how insecure your Wi-Fi is and how much of your personal data is being bled out of you at all moments, at all times. And so what we did is they set up this Wi-Fi sniffing iOS system. So it presented in, the Keep Calm, Carry On. It's that font, that style, and it would just sit there just saying, Ministry of Citizens Safety and Communications, just to sit very idly in the room. However, when anyone in the hotel decided to look at porn, it would change rapidly and flash, and it would say which IP was looking at porn. So we created effectively a whitelist and blacklist that can highlight what the public Wi-Fi space was doing, and if at any moment it crossed over any pre-demarcated lines of acceptability, then we could flag it. Obviously, this opened up some really interesting conversations about what was on the whitelist and what was on the blacklist and what to be put on. So obviously, you could put Disney.com, and then you could flash out this insane alarm telling people that they were looking at porn, etc. Obviously, we could also do some interesting things, which is we can actually ping these people directly to their computer using net messaging and pop up a little message saying, we've noticed you're watching porn. Obviously, none of these things are illegal, and you should not be doing anything to compromise other people's security, not even for your own personal amusement. So that was one interesting project, which we obviously had to not display publicly because it's massively illegal. We did the usual sort of things: 3D printing, scanning, Connect hacking. But when we run the second one of the things I was really sort of excited about was trying to work out how we sort of not monetize, because that's a commercial, capitalistic, but horrible word, but how does one actually make the most use of this capability? How does one effectively create an agency of change that connects artists and hackers and other disparate people, architects, academics, and actually create something that has meaningful value instead of, for example, taking public money, where the outcomes are often quite hard to hit and quite difficult to meet. How do you actually take either brand money or finance from additional people and create something that has genuine meaning, and almost create a sort of a policy think tank that actually creates real, genuine physical products that enables communication regarding a variety of different things? The answer is I don't know how you do that, but I do know that when it comes to collaboration, it's infinitely easier than you ever think it is, as long as you don't give anyone any rules in which they need to operate in. So again, like lots of things, if you define what you're trying to achieve before you even start it, you will never achieve the thing you set out to do, because you will have realised you've hamstrung yourself in the process of trying to be creative, because you've already stopped being creative at the moment you're trying to find what you're trying to create. So in of itself, if you want to see what can happen, you have to not define that outcome. You can't predict what people will do. You cannot predict what they will create. You cannot predict how they will interact. However, as soon as you start to put any sort of fence around them, and the only fence I do believe in is time, but that's because I unfortunately think that people are lazy. That's the only one that is really the most essential for me. That and treating people with a modicum of care and respect, like feeding them and looking after them and making sure they can sleep. But these are the only limitations that we've ever imposed at the Beards with our art hacks, and we've gone from Whitechapel to the Barbican and this year to the Tate, and we've been featured in The Guardian, The Wired, Independent. We've produced businesses out of what has been created, and I think we've produced some genuinely meaningful interactive art that has potential conversations around society and change. And I think ultimately, when I define what I want art to do, it needs to be able to communicate to me something meaningful about society that I exist in. So that's all I know, that's all I've ever done, and I think it's probably a good idea to get some sandwiches now. But yeah, do work together, and I think try to define what you're expecting to see less, and try not to be so scared of people. I think that's probably the easiest ending. Thank you.
Thank you.